Surveillance techniques and technology are proliferating around the world, causing largely untold and unknown damage to people by allowing governments to spy with few limits. Key to fighting this is understanding how these techniques are being spread in the first place and who has the power to help stop this and to help keep their use in check. One of the most important players here is the European Union, which is the world's largest provider of aid, helps lift millions of people out of poverty, and works to end conflict and empower communities in some of the most deprived places on earth. But there's also been dramatic change in recent EU policies, which has shifted away from things like providing humanitarian aid to also providing more and more security and military aid, which includes things like providing equipment and training to police and military forces, as well as surveillance technology and support to police across the world. One of the regions where this is most visible is in the Sahel in Africa, which is from European capitals and news agendas far away and is seldom talked about unless it's in the context of terrorism or migration coming to Europe. A recent parliamentary resolution called for more security cooperation, explicitly citing the impact of the climate crisis and its potential to cause insecurity in a region where some 60% of people work in agriculture, but where temperatures are rising 1.5 times faster than in the rest of the world, and where 80% of agricultural land has been degraded. This, despite the fact that these countries are amongst the lowest emitters of carbon in the world. To better understand what's going on, what kind of surveillance and security aid the EU is providing, and the impact of all this, I spoke to Giacomo Zandanini, an Italian journalist who has spent years following these developments and was kind enough to share his incredible insight into all this. Enjoy.
Thanks a lot for taking the time, Giacomo. How are you doing?
I'm fine. Thank you very much, Edin.
How was your pandemic?
Well, I mean, like most of the at least Western world,
yeah,
blocked at
Italy
home.
Was like, I remember, obviously we were in the UK, and I remember Italy with Lombardy. It's kind of like at the forefront of the pandemic in Europe. That was like when shit really started to get real.
Yeah.
So are you able to travel then, or have you been stuck in Rome?
Initially, it was a bit hard because there was actually all my reporting was linked to traveling, so everything was blocked. And all that I've been doing in the past months before the pandemic erupted was completely uninteresting for the media. I mean, because everything was pandemic, I had worked in Nigeria right before the lockdown, and on migrants deported from Europe, but it took about 6 months to get the story published.
So how would you describe the main kind of focus of your work and what kind of issues you're interested in yourself?
Actually, I've been working especially around topics that have to do with migration, refugees, also because I have a background as a social worker and community worker working with refugees in Italy, so that was quite natural, and I had some knowledge about the issue. But then I also expanded a bit this, trying to look at how European policies have been shaping migration, have been restricting migration, have been also creating a human rights emergency, let's say, over the past 6 years for sure, but let's say the past 10 years at least. And also this brought me to travel, especially to the Sahel, to Niger, where I've been going over the past 5 years quite often. And West Africa in general became kind of my let's say, favorite place to look at this phenomenon, look at European cooperation over migration, look at the local impact of these policies, and also expand towards other type of European cooperation. For example, cooperation on security, which often overlaps with migration, and also a cooperation on border control, and this type of interventions are really interconnected.
So just honestly, for people like me, so taking a step back, the Sahel, that broadly represents like the region under the Sahara, or?
That's right. I mean, the Sahel, the name comes from the Arabic Sahel, which means the coast. So it's the southern coast of the Sahara Desert, basically. But now, most of the time, so it's a quite huge and long stretch of semi-arid lands from west to eastern Africa.
Yeah.
But now we refer to the Sahel most of the time with the definition which was taken from the French as a former colonizers of the so-called Central and Western Sahel, which basically means Chad, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Mauritania, and Senegal, depending on the definition. So it's kind of more a political than a geographical one.
Nice. So is France was that the dominant colonial power in its recent history, or was there other countries? Do a lot of people speak French in the region, or?
Yeah, France was the colonial power. All these countries that now we call the Sahel were former French colonies, were part of the French colony of West Africa, with different names, different borders, and different histories of decolonization. But yeah, basically the presence and the influence of France is still very strong. And debated, and the source of conflict, as we've been seeing in the past years, over jihadist insurgencies in Mali, specifically military response by France, and all even the European policies surrounding this counter-terrorism response.
So when you're like a freelancer, and I guess you pitch stories to editors or they commission you, what kind of issues are they interested in covering, mostly for like the international English-speaking media?
Yeah, well, as you might well imagine, I mean, there's been a moment where migration was interesting, and especially in Niger, because Niger was kind of on the top of the European agenda all of a sudden after decades of I mean, even not knowing exactly where the country was by most Western media, and confusing it with Nigeria. But then it popped up in 2016 when it was difficult to control migration in Libya because of the conflict of not having a stable government and counterparts. And so Niger was seen as a good partner to prevent people from entering Libya, because it's exactly south of Libya, and most people from West African countries were transiting through Niger to reach Libya, and then some of them would also try to cross the Mediterranean Sea. But then now the migration story is a bit down, let's say. So what's on the top of the Western agenda, and this is also reproduced by the media, is the jihadist presence, jihadist insurgencies, which are a very complex phenomenon involving local communities, involving different local dynamics, which also date back to the colonial time. But what's the most interesting angle is just how Western powers are fighting jihadists, how they're convincing them to abandon, are convincing fighters to abandon these groups, and this is all still the main story today. Then there's a quite recent trend towards environmental stories, and the Sahel is at the forefront of climate change, with higher temperatures in an already really hot region over the past years, natural catastrophes. So it's also unfortunately a good setting for stories that show how climate change is impacting populations.
I remember there was a EU parliamentary resolution passed last year which talked, I mean, the thing is they took this approach that talked about the effects of climate change and desertification, particularly on pastoral communities that were moving between borders, how then that might be driving local grievances, how then that might be driving migration, and then just took an approach that basically said, we need to help the security forces keep control of this, because this is going to come back to us. So it seems as though like that relationship is very much characterized by how issues like migration or desertification can affect European countries. Are they mostly interested in things like migration and what they would perceive as global counterterrorism?
Yeah, I would say the global counterterrorism agenda is shaping the Western intervention in the Sahel now. Even if it's an area also of clash between different interests. We are seeing this now in Mali, where as soon as France announced they would start retiring their troops, quite slowly actually, then Mali started discussing with Russia on having Russian mercenaries on its territories to defend, to support at least basically the elites, because usually these mercenaries are not intervening in dangerous areas. They're just defending the capital city and trying to, they're used as a sort of presidential guard, like it's happening in the Central African Republic. And so it's an area of where there are multiple interests now, but basically the idea, which is repeated continuously by European leaders, that this is when they are also justifying the interventions in the Sahel, is that what's happening in the Sahel as a reflection on Europe is not really proved, is not really verified by facts and by researchers, scholars, and that know this area. I mean, specifically when coming to terrorism, because it's a really complex phenomenon, as I was saying. It's intertwined with the local frustrations by marginal groups which have been recruited, and the same fact of having a Western intervention was seen as a motivation for many people to join violent non-state alarmed groups. Also, there is a colonial legacy which is strong and also influences politics, mobilization by local citizens, and it's seen specifically as a negative fact, kind of. And this is also something that France has to deal with now. So the CT counterterrorism agenda is really on top of Western interests. But then practically what some media are failing to do is to also expose what are the interests behind this emphasis on counterterrorism. What are the industrial groups making money out of it? What are the drivers of these interests? And what are the real impact of this intervention? This support to security forces, heavy support to security forces on the ground.
I think it's very tempting for groups, I mean, locally in the countries which you're focusing on, but also internationally, to kind of perceive very complex local dynamics and local drivers as part of a global narrative. So, very complex regional and local conflicts being reduced to this global war on jihadism that then is part of a global thing. So you need to force global action onto it, when actually it's so much more complex than that in so many scenarios that we're seeing. Going back to the issue of migration, what's the deal with Libya at the moment? Is that still what the European leaders see as the hotspot for migration when it comes to going to Europe, or what's happening there at the moment?
Well, actually, the European intervention on migration in the Sahel, which is focused on Niger, has been somehow effective, but combined with lots of other interventions. Lots of people were arrested in Niger, in northern Niger specifically, people that were connected to organizing migrant travels across the Sahara Desert to Libya. And there was a law criminalizing all this type of activities that was adopted in 2015 under European pressure and under European guidance. There was a set of measures which had to do also with the need by the Nigerian need by the Nigerian elites to have an international recognition, to have support from external partners in a difficult moment where internally they were quite weak. I mean, the party in power, and while now they consolidated kind of their power over even internally, I would say, with also the recent elections in Niger. But if you look back at 6-7 years ago, the system was weaker, and they needed that sort of legitimization, and migration was used also to obtain it, to attract some funding, but most of the funding from the EU actually went to European actors, were NGOs and well, let's say European and international actors, so NGOs, but basically the UN system, UN agencies, and national cooperation agencies of European countries. So through this, they were able to reduce movements, northbound movements from Niger to Libya, even if there's no real statistics. So when you hear European politicians say, okay, we succeeded in stopping migration to Libya, well, actually, we don't know, because the statistics I mean, the count of the people passing by in a remote desert trail, which is already very difficult to do, but has been done in the past years, always in the same places basically. So it means around police checkpoints, somewhere close to a village in the desert. But what happened with these new policies is that people were forced to take longer and much more dangerous routes to avoid the checkpoints, because they were arrested otherwise. The drivers would be arrested, and the passengers would be blocked and sent back and convinced to stop the travel. So, of course, people are avoiding all this control that were put in place also thanks to European money, making the trip much more dangerous. So, but there's also other elements. Actually, cooperation with Libya has increased in the meanwhile, especially with the so-called Libyan Coast Guard. People are not able anymore to cross the Mediterranean. It's really difficult. Lots of people have been repeatedly pushed back in the Mediterranean. So overall, the possibility to reach Europe entering through Italy and then passing through Niger and Libya before have reduced. So lots of people have been choosing different ways, like going to the Canary Islands, for example, over the past 2 years, and trying other ways to reach a safe place where they could work, they could find safety. And
you've seen that dynamic, like even in the Channel. So like in the UK, we've got this kind of manufactured crisis at the moment of these Channel boats, and what they're doing again is exactly what you said, just making the journey more dangerous. So actually more lives are being lost, and actually empowering like actual predatory smugglers, because then they make a business out of, because it's more complicated. There's no legal routes, there's no safe routes. So all that's going to inevitably do is empower the smugglers. And we've also seen it in various Mediterranean routes. I think it's quite a powerful narrative for governments to say we're cracking down on these predatory smuggling groups. Was that what it was in Niger? Were these all like exploitative like smugglers out to essentially rip people off and endanger them and harm them, or were they more complicated groups than that? Like, what was the actual effect of illegalizing smuggling, as they called it?
There's a French researcher, Julien Brachet, who's been working in Niger for the past more than 10 years, 12 years, I would say. And his observation, his analysis is that smugglers have been created by Europe, basically in northern Niger. It's a long story because it's a story of progressively illegalizing movements under a European push. And so this, of course, brought to much more dangers, and also empowered groups that were connected maybe to other types of trafficking, like weapons, like drug trafficking, which were basically not necessarily connected with people transporting migrants. But now what's happening is that these groups, which have a stronger network and also potentially they can they have good relations with the local security forces in some cases, so they're able to pass by in some checkpoints or to avoid control. So they've been basically empowered. So it's we can say on one side that European intervention also fueled trafficking, actually, because it moved from an organized activity, because you can say it wasn't organized, with lots of people involved, with thousands of people in the region of Agadez in northern Niger that were working in the migration business or industry, to transport, to feed, to sell basic items to people on the move, to drive. Of course, the drivers were a part of this, but then it was a hierarchic and structural system where newcomers could maybe enter, but it was not so easy. And very few people had contacts with others that would, in different paths along the migration trail, foreigners were involved. For example, someone from Senegal at one point that was stuck in Niger at one point could become a part of this complex and informal network by trying to bring Senegalese in a specific place and convince them to go with a specific driver to Libya. The crossing of the Sahara takes from 3 days to 1 week most of the times, if there's no big problems with your vehicle. But everything was kind of happening under the sun, very openly up to 2016. You could travel from Agadez to midway to Libya with a military escort, which was provided to all local citizens going to this area of the desert because they were going for either gold mining, either for commercial activities, because there's some oases also producing dates, producing also salt. So, and also there are commercial links between across the Sahara, between Libya, Niger, and Chad. So the military was there to escort basically everybody, including migrants. So it was kind of something happening and something bringing money to local families, and not a business that was profitable only, for the top guys that were moving millions. No, it was something which was kind of, helping local communities in Agadez to cope with the difficulties of living in a desert town with scarce, with little economic opportunities. And all this system was destroyed in the span of a year between 2016 and 2017 because of European intervention. Then, I mean, you can say, of course, it was dangerous in some cases. Already, we had, people were dying in the desert because it's a dangerous trip. And people were crammed in pickups, on the back of these pickups, like 20, 25, 28 people. Weather conditions are really bad. But then at the same time, it was, there was kind of more control up to 2016. People were transiting, passing on the main trail to Libya, which means if I have a problem with my vehicle and my passengers are under the sun and they finish their water, which is very limited, like 5 liters for a few days in the desert, it's basically nothing. So if I have a problem, probably someone will pass by, because anyway there's a truck passing by carrying cigarettes or carrying fuel, carrying whatever from Libya to Niger, because Libya is a richer country. They kept importing goods even illegally to Niger and other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So that was it was safer somehow, even if accidents still happened. What happened is now accidents are happening completely out of any radar. Maybe satellites could detect accidents, but they are not there or drones. There are US drones flying from northern Niger. There are French drones. There are drones provided by Europe also to the local civil protection to monitor areas in northern Niger, even if they are small drones. I mean, it's not the big US drones. But yeah, they're not interested in looking after a migrant Toyota pickup stranded somewhere between the dunes, let's say.
I mean that is the priority. It's people's lives, right? That's leading to risking, and that should always be at the forefront. Like I remember reading, this seems to just get completely glossed over, but they had an agreement with the ECOWAS, the kind of regional economic community, that there would be free movement, right? And then this seems to have just come in and totally been like, well, our interest isn't in free movement, so we're just going to stop that. And also that a lot of communities were traveling across borders anyway, and then just basically had to stop.
Yeah, basically, as you said, there was an agreement. There is an agreement since 1979 of free circulation in the economic community of Western African state, which Niger, which Sahel countries are part of, except from Chad. But Chad then has an agreement with Niger. So it's like a Schengen area in the EU with also other countries included. So it's actually because of bilateral agreements. So actually it's more than 15, and you can travel around this area if you're a citizen of the ECOWAS just with your own ID. There will be checks at borders, at land borders, but you don't need a visa basically, and you can stay for up to 3 months. Similar rules than the EU, but this was enforced much earlier than the Schengen area. So it's a quite ancient era of free circulation. And basically, this free circulation was reflecting the fact that people were moving a lot around because of their, basic livelihoods. There were, nomadic population, but not only people, traders and of all kinds moving along, and this was vital for communities also because parts of these borders were designed by colonial powers, so they didn't reflect really the relation and the historical connections between communities, between trading areas, between local resources and populations. What's happening, well, with the case of Niger, sort of half of the country at one point, under European pressure, was cut out from this zone. So now if a Senegalese wants to travel to northern Niger, he can't do it basically, because the only way to access northern Niger is to take a pickup or a truck and go in the desert, because there's no tarmac road anymore. But it's illegal basically, because the driver that brings you would risk spending years in prison. So it's not legal. I mean, you could go there, but it's a bit difficult to go there alone. And the potential risk of migration, this is what is being addressed. I might be a Senegalese willing to reach Libya, and I can't take a plane for some reason, but I have my family in Libya. Well, I can't travel through northern Niger to reach Libya in any way because I'm considered as a potential migrant to the European soil. And yeah, and basically broadly in the ECOWAS region, we can say that European intervention is trying to shape local seasonary or migration movements that were connected to economic activities as international migration. So introducing more border controls, convincing local governments that they need to increase border control, that they need to check people, that's for security reasons. So they're using mostly the security angle to convince people, also to convince governments to monitor people, to take their personal information, to register ID cards, to have biometric passports, to have biometric voting cards, to have, even when the normal civil status system is not completely set up, and people are not registered at birth, still they're trying to kind of go to 3 steps after that and saying, okay, but you need to biometrically register people at borders, even if people, maybe children in some areas of the country, don't even have a birth certificate and they can't access basic rights maybe. So it's kind of this emphasis also shifted priorities from maybe integrating inclusion of local communities, providing them with opportunities which reducing poverty, which on paper should be the priorities of international development cooperation, but then also it was kind of diverted to these interventions, which are still considered as development cooperation somehow. I mean, also technically, they're most of the time considered as development cooperation because, yeah, we are developing the police. We're giving them a best system to track down terrorists, but actually they're recording information by normal citizens passing through a border point.
So you mentioned biometrics and some other kind of technology. I think you covered a lot of that in a report you put out recently with ActionAid. What were the main findings? Like, what was that report covering?
Well, the report for ActionAid was basically looking at Italian funds following the Italian public money for migration control in Africa and in the Mediterranean Sea. So basically trying to track down how much money Italy had spent, where the money had been spent, in terms of intervening in migration in Africa, in the Mediterranean, and the so-called Central Mediterranean, and then in Africa, to what they say, how they call it today, is to manage migration, which most of the time is a technical way to say to stop migration, basically. Yeah, so as everybody is well aware of, it's really difficult to track down government money in any case, to reconstruct spending by different ministries, to reconstruct exactly who is implementing the projects and the likes. And in the case of Italy, it has been a big amount of money which was integrated by European Union money, kind of specifically for some funds like the European Union Trust Fund for Africa, so-called, which was adopted in 2015 and will last until this year. And in this case, I mean, there was a convergence of Italian and European interests in reducing migration not only from Libya but from more than 20 countries in Africa, mostly North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, which were interested somehow by the migration phenomenon and the migration that was towards Europe, because we are not interested at all in Nigerians moving to South Africa. That's not completely on the radars of European policymakers. You can also understand that, but at the same time, it's kind of, when you want to intervene in migration policies, you need to think of a global phenomenon where people are moving internally in a country, in neighboring countries, in other countries, and inside Africa, and so it's kind of very reductive to, and sometimes counterproductive to look at migration only when it's potentially coming to Europe.
And it's framed as the trust fund for Africa, and it's, I think, overwhelmingly derived from the EU Development Fund. So I think it's like budget is like 6 and 5 of it or so is from the main European Development Fund. So it's actually money that is for the benefit of the people there.
Yeah, definitely. So the critics say it's not aligned with the principles of international development cooperation, humanitarian systems, which means neutrality, which means being aligned with local interests, ownership by local authorities of this project, and also a set of very precise indicators. But it's so clear that these are European interests, that these are European priorities which are imposed on local population. But at the same time, we don't have to, we have to consider that local governments have been profiting out of this. So it's not just European authorities going to Niger or to Senegal or to Nigeria and saying, okay, guys, we're much more powerful than you. You need to do this. You need to start registering fingerprints of people at land borders, so we know who these people are. And maybe in the future, we will be able to interconnect our databases with yours, or to cross-match data and see whether someone has exactly reconstruct the migration movement of someone across Africa before he tried to reach the European borders. So it's not only this, but it's only not Europe imposing their own priorities, but it's also local authorities trying to direct these European interests and to use it also in a way which is meaningful for them, which means attracting money, but especially attracting support, and one of the ways by which they can do this is to direct money to local law enforcement agencies, because we all know that there's a long history of military coups in Africa. There's a long history of distrust between people in power and security forces. And when they're able to attract money, external money, to the police, to the gendarmerie, to the military, well, that's a way to kind of fill this gap a bit and saying, okay, I mean, military coups happened in the past, are still happening today. But what if the government is letting you have this very lucrative deal to have helicopters, to have training, to have equipment, and also to have money, because there's also stories of corruption behind these issues. There's big contracts for the military. There's also demand from Europe to increase spending, military or security spending at a general level. It's also business for the local leaderships. So we don't have to overlook this part of the story.
Just on that, in Niger, how is the human rights situation? Has it improved, would you say, generally since 2015, since all these security forces have been equipped and empowered and trained? or would you say it's got worse? Or
yeah, taking the example of Niger, so there's this huge European interest from 2015-16 specifically around migration. Then today it's more around security in general, including migration and more counterterrorism, border control. Lots of money, hundreds of millions of euros invested in Niger, but basically, at the same time, we've seen a deterioration of the civic space, of freedom of speech, of freedom of assembly, of the possibility for activists to express themselves, both in the, let's say, online space on social media, and also in the public space. So there's been a restriction of basic rights in Niger, for sure, over the past years. More repressive policies put in place. And of course, European donors have been closing their eyes a bit, because Niger has become a crucial partner for what is dubbed as stability in the Sahel, which means a lot of things and means nothing, basically, also in the end. Yeah, there were activists and journalists and bloggers arrested over tweets, over social media posts, over articles. There were people judicially harassed, also including journalists, for their publications that were criticizing also governmental policies. What local activists are saying most of the times is we once had an idea of Europe, the European Union, as a potential partner, especially in the past. There was a military regime in Niger, and there were times where repression was even much stronger than today. But with this new emphasis on migration and border control, they perceive now the EU as a sort of enemy, as a sort of actor which is complicit with the government in the repression of and the reduction of civil space. And so also this is very important. And we've seen in what has happened in Mali, for example, with the 2 military coups in the span of 1 year, with the huge street protests, and Europe is seen somehow as, of course, very linked to French interests, and there is an old frustration and old resentment towards France, but also is seen as an actor which is imposing their own will, which is also supporting a corrupt government. So basically, that's also what's happening. Human rights, not only for the migrants, of course, human rights of migrants are much more at risk now in Niger, but also human rights of local citizens have been put at risk, and the EU is not seen as a friend by human rights defenders, by even if the EU is still supporting the National Human Rights Commission, supporting some local NGOs, but basically that's nothing compared to what they are doing in terms of supporting the military, supporting the police, supporting the government, also with direct budget support, so injecting money into the budget of the state.
And at the same time, let's not forget, you also have like the US agencies involved. You talked about Russian mercenaries before, Chinese investment as well. So it's not as if there's a lack of equipment or training for security forces there as well. It's just one of the things that like boggles the mind, because even if you want to be as generous as you want to the European countries and say, okay, you're concerned about migration, it's within your right to train as many security forces as you want, as to abdicate all moral responsibility, and like even if you're going to lead to human rights abuses. But the long-term strategy just makes no sense, because all that's going to do is fuel corruption, fuel human rights abuses, fuel extremism, and then fuel migration. The strategy itself makes no sense whatsoever. It just, yeah, like I said, boggles the mind. Back to your report on the Italian spending, how easy was it to track the funds that you did?
Well, tracking the funds for what is called externalization, external migration policies, is always difficult because it's a mix of security, of development, humanitarian assistance. This is channeled in different ways. So basically, if you look at development, there's this idea which is rooted now in EU policymakers of the root causes, of addressing the root causes, which actually has been contested by many scholars as well, because on one side we can say that the same root causes of migrations are the wrongdoings of Western companies which have huge interests, like in mineral resources in most countries in Africa, for example, and this is not going to the local population at all, and also in some cases it's kind of polluting the environment and forcing people to flee. But then the fact that development studies prove that there's not a univoc relation between being more developed, let's say, and migrating less. So if it might even be that if I have a bit more of money, I will be keener to migrate, because I want to. It's an investment. And it costs money migrating, but it can turn out to be a profitable investment for not only for myself, for my whole family community.
The desperately poor don't migrate. It's people with a bit of income, a bit of support, who've got the capability to do it. So the underlying assumption just isn't proven by fact whatsoever.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. And then just to add something, what we realized while working on this report is that most of the money was spent on border control, and most of the programs, the projects, even if they were shaped with different objectives, like presented like this is an anti-trafficking project, this is a project to support the governance of migration in Libya, in Tunisia, in Egypt. But actually, at the basis, there was an idea that the real solution was to heavily control borders, and which is a paradox, because traffickers were born out of border control, or out of hard borders, out of situations where people were where there were walls, where there were, it was really impossible to move on. And this is where actual traffickers enter, and they might also be willing at some point not just to bring you from A to B, but to exploit your situation and to ask you for a lot of money, to ask you to do something for them, to ask you to sell drugs, to force you into prostitution. And so it's kind of it's the paradox of trying to block borders and using very expensive technologies, especially in the Mediterranean Sea, but also along migration routes in Africa. It's just selling a fake solution that borders would also be the best tool against traffickers, which is completely untrue. I'm not saying that border controls might also be useful. There's actually bad people moving around, but at the same time, selling this as a solution to stop the bad people, it's when coming to migration, it's not true. It's not. It's kind of it's more it's a war against migrants. It's not a war against smugglers, as the EU proclaimed it in 2015 with the agenda on migration and with the and this it's been coming out if you look at the funding, because most of the money from Italy in this case, but I've been working in the past on European money to Nigeria, on European money to Niger, and basically most of these funds are going to increase border control and to support security forces and to implement forced returns of migrants, or so-called voluntary returns, which sometimes are not completely voluntary, I would say, to all a set of interventions that are actually trying to remove people from areas which are closer to Europe, to create a sort of buffer zone in North Africa, from which we are sure that migrants will not attempt the dangerous Mediterranean crossing, for example.
And what proportion of that spending did you find went on providing legal and safe routes? Was it at all matching the border control expenditure? Or?
Well, basically, we looked at Italy, external migration spending in Africa and the Mediterranean Sea from 2015 to 2020. So a very crucial moment for this type of spending, where it was expanded all of a sudden. And 1% of the total spending was devoted to creating legal channels, compared to about 50% devoted to border controls. And we are speaking about 1.3 billion euros in total. Then some estimates are also a bit higher, but then it depends on the methodology we use to calculate this sum. But yeah, there's nothing. Legal channels, well, there's even in the new pact on migration of the European Union, there's more emphasis on the talent partnership, on skilled migration, on but practically it's very the European governments are really shy. Well, the pandemic might also have shown quite clearly what are the problems of this and what could be the perspectives if Europe is lacking from basic workers in different fields. But yeah, at the same time, this populist discourse around migration is still quite strong everywhere in Europe, even if we don't have the migration news are not hitting the front pages of newspapers every day like in 2015, but still it's a very strong topic for the political debate. So I don't see it as coming quite shortly in the short run that legal pathways will have more resources and will be also considered as a real opportunity on both sides. It's quite problematic. Yeah.
So with regards to the report, did you have any recommendations that came out of it, like any areas that you thought the EU needs to improve or the Italian government needs to improve on?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's important to build what to actually build, try building what are called what have been called by the EU Commission equal partnerships. But what does this mean in practice? It's also working with the local civil society and considering that in some countries which have authoritarian regimes in Africa or semi-authoritarian regimes, it's not enough to discuss with the government because it's not representative, because they've been coming to power by untransparent elections, and so you can't really, as a European donor, focus only in working with the government. If you want to build a relationship which is will last, and also will not fall against the concurrence, the competition of other actors like China or Russia today, or Turkey, for example. So, well, basically, the recommendation is to get back to become also a partner for what regards, expanding the civic space, liberties, civil liberties, and at the same time for free speech, so the idea is that Europe needs to also try to address local grievances somehow. I mean, then at the same time, I would say, at a very general level, I feel that it's very difficult to kind of decolonize all this type of interventions. And now that the Sahel is it's at the center of a new international, geopolitical competition, and Europe feels they need, for example, they need to be there actually, and it's just not to lose grounds to other actors. So it's very complex, but in terms of the migration, migration. Intervention in Africa, or migration spending, European migration spending in Africa, it must be more aligned with human rights, because this is not only, an issue of respecting human rights as a value, but also of kind of creating the base for some local consensus of these policies. And also, at the same time, legal pathways have to be clearly expanded. And also, development cooperation, which I'm quite often critical about development cooperation, but needs to be addressed actually to fighting poverty, or to creating opportunities for local communities, and not to fighting migrants, which are the same people that are looking for opportunities. And it's then at the same time we have to recognize it's because if we address a lot of money to returning people from Libya, Niger, or Mali or Sudan to other countries, so they can go back to their own countries of origin and not continue to travel to North Africa and then potentially Europe, then we are taking away much money that could be provided for vital assistance to populations which are really in need in most areas in the Sahel, where there is a conflict, where they don't have access to basic things like food and water and education. So it's then probably as a journalist, I don't really feel I need to give any recommendation, any potential solution to governments. Well, of course, this is more for NGOs and to do, but for example, civil organization and activists. But there's a lot. There's many ways to increase, and one of the things that I think it's quite important to recognize that migration has been entering, the diplomacy, geopolitical negotiations, over relation between governments and states as one of the many aspects of this big game. And it's important also to ask governments to be transparent about what they're doing, and to also be transparent about who's behind this, who's driving this, who's pushing this big spending on migration. Like in Italy, we have historically an interest on Libya. And this is also why, I mean, it's not just a geographical proximity, it's also why Italy is seen also from the European Union as a key actor, and the EU is channeling funds through Italy to reduce migration, to equip the Coast Guard, and now they're trying to invest much more, which is also very untransparent in southern Libya, kind of to seal the Sahara borders much more than what they did so far in Niger. But if you ask to have documents, if you want to understand exactly where this money is going, this is almost impossible.
So we tried it ourselves with, we spent a year, we've got very fucking smart lawyers who can word very detailed and articulate access to documents requests, who know all the agencies to get to, and then you end up in a backwards and forwards kind of fight between public agencies who are using public money for the supposed public good to get any information out of them. It's just unbelievable. So I think the basic thing they could do is at least make this transparent about what's driving it, who the money's going to, how it's being used, and what actual impact it's having, rather than just this black box of millions have been spent on something that's meant to be aid, but we just don't know. So I mean, it's kind of scandalous that it takes journalists and people like us having to find this information out.
Well, and I'm sure, I mean, now the interest on migration has been somehow reducing. Well, of course, I think like in the UK with the channel situation, and sometimes in Italy it gets back because politicians like to use migration as a weapon of consensus. But then if you look at stories of migrants, if you look at stories of people on the move, if you look at how this has been changing, there's little happening in the media, except from some investigations which are, exposing wrongdoings by European agency Frontex, or exposing, how mass surveillance tools are being tested on migrants and refugees and the likes, which are really vital. But I think it's also vital to continue monitoring the European spending out of Europe on migration, because this money are just increasing. And what happened in the past years as a kind of test with the EU Trust Fund for Africa, other instruments that were redirected towards migration, then is happening now and will happen in the next years in a more structured way. And technologies and surveillance tools which will have a much deeper impact, and the idea of also continuing to export or to pay for example, databases in different countries in Africa to be implemented. It's also it has been happening in the past in a quite sometimes confused way. Now they're trying to kind of increase this, because the idea is that also stepping up the deportation machine of the European Union is important, and we need more data on the people in Europe, but also in countries of transit and origin, in order to be able to repatriate them easily, in order to, then lots of way to to justify this spending. But basically, then there's a big push from law enforcement agencies in the EU and to acquire more data, to be able to access to more personal data in even in Africa. and this is also something to look at significantly.
Yeah, definitely, because it's there's this kind of very nice and fuzzy idea of databases and having access to an identity, and it comes from, remember, like the standard development goals, this big agenda and push to kind of, I think they were the Millennium Goals. And one of them was essentially that everyone should have access to an identity. And that is actually quite important because, you can actually prove that you're a citizen, that like you can have access to certain rights, that you can vote and whatnot. So you need access to an identity. But then they've taken it a step further and said, oh, we're going to make it a biometric identity, which is not something that you need, So oftentimes they've rushed to get everyone enrolled into these digital ID systems. And you suspect it's exactly like you say, it's because they want to be able to track who's moving across borders. And if you see, for example, you talked about the EU pressure on the law that criminalized migration in Niger, you can see there's articles in there that say if an international agency sends a data request to prove someone's citizenship that might be Nigerian, that the Nigerian authorities should have to then verify them. And that's very much seems conducive towards this basically implementing deportations from Europe. So you can see how these big digital ID systems are essentially being funneled and financed for those reasons.
Yeah, definitely. And then, then also this clearly seems like an example of European priority creating problems in Africa. Because if there's not an existing and working civil status system which provides everybody at birth with a just document, which allows you to go to school as a kid, to just prove your identity, then why do the same country need a biometric voting system where you scan the iris, and why is it needed if actually then it's the information is recorded, but then it's not used to vote. It doesn't lead to a fair vote, transparent vote, because there's always problems. There's a further push, and what will happen in the next years probably. I feel there's an interest by advocacy groups, rights groups in Europe and also in Africa. And I would say also what I think is one of the important issues is to create alliances, to create relations, and to because as let's say as European citizens, we are interested in how our money is being spent and what's the impact. Then people in Africa, there are activists, there are journalists, there are local groups working on these issues, which are also interested on the practical impact they're seeing on their community, and it's important to build these alliances also to avoid this continuous European gaze and interest, and avoid even on our side to fall on the same trap of having our thoughts in mind and say, well, this is crucial for Africa, but what people is this important even for a journalist in Africa to investigate these issues, or it's more important to look at other things? So I think it's vital to create relationships, to create connections, to tackle this, and also to effectively monitor what is going on with the European money in this country, because and this is for sure, interesting for in my experience for on both sides of the Mediterranean, let's say. So I think this is because we have a privilege that we can travel, we can access most places in Africa, even some places that have become quite dangerous over the past years. But I mean, it's not the same for our friends, colleagues, journalists, activists, community organizers in Africa. Most of the times they find it very difficult to travel to Europe. But it's important to use this privilege, well, also to try to discuss about this and to use it in a good way, which is also, supporting actually and creating links and relations locally.
So you mentioned drones earlier on and involvement of a lot of companies, that actually a lot of this money that's being provided is staying inside European actors. Could you maybe just talk a bit more about what kind of technology you're seeing and what kind of companies or actors this money is going towards?
Yeah, well, coming to the Mediterranean Sea, of course, it's a different set of surveillance technologies which are basically connected to a maritime presence, military presence, basically of the Italian Navy, and then a Frontex operation, and now everybody, all these actors are using. Then there's also UNAV FORMED, which is a European Union military mission, security mission in the central Mediterranean Sea. And all these actors are using drones, but also they're using a kind of systems to analyze data and to transfer data between them in a quite fast way, which have been, there's also research and development projects funded by the EU under programs like Horizon 2020, which have been tested in the central Mediterranean. And at the same time, so they're using satellites, imageries, and sensors to be able to spot boats at a very early stage, and to be able to alert the Libyan Coast Guard or the Libyan Navy in order to intervene and bring people back. Basically, even if in many cases we know that this is illegal, and lawyers and are also saying, and activists, that this is completely legal, because actually Libya can't be considered as a safe port, as a safe zone. So it's not aligned with the international norms.
Just can I outline that? What's happening in Libya at the moment?
See, we are having, basically, even if we are in a moment where the now 10-year-old conflict in Libya is kind of, reduced. Actually, there's a process of sort of national reconciliation between different bodies and governments and militias, which were, detaining power of different areas and regions of Libya. And there is an attempt somehow internationally by the so-called international community, but also by different actors in Libya, to push for elections in December. But basically, if we look at the condition of people passing, of migrants and refugees, it's still the same. Some detention centers have been closed, but basically there's no way for people to be to regularize their presence in Libya. And what's happening is that migrant refugees are routinely brought to detention centers where they are tortured, where they are enslaved, where they are sold, where they are maltreated in different ways, where there are conditions that have been denounced by the UN and everybody else, basically, as amounting potentially also to to international war crimes in some cases, to different types of crimes.
So if you're then intercepting people in the Mediterranean with drones or aircraft or satellites, and then tipping off the Libyan authorities, that's basically what you're sending them to.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the whole interception system was kind of refined since 2017, and Italy had a crucial role in this because at the time, in equipping and coordinating, and still today, it sounds quite shocking to know that Italian Navy vessels are docked in Tripoli in Libya, and they are part of the interception system. Information, the whole Maritime Rescue Coordination Center, which was created in Libya in 2018, if I'm not wrong, officially was actually guided and built by Italy, by Italian government actors, and still today they're having a crucial role in this. I mean, it's something which the Italian role in given their prior relations with Libya in this interception system, which has been refined over the past years, is really central. And basically people are spotted by drones, by airplanes, and immediately now there's a communication system between Frontex, UNAVFOR Med, the Italian Navy, and other actors in the central Mediterranean Sea to report the position of these dinghies or crowded wooden boats to authorities in Libya, so they can intervene, and also to support all this so-called rescue activity, and which actually brings people back to detention and to torture. So this is a part of these technologies are devoted to this increased control of the Mediterranean Sea. Which means drones, which means, of course, it's just airplanes and vessels, and but also the technologies which is adopted by security agencies in order to exchange data in a very quick time with different actors at the same time, to have a sort of complete view of what is happening in from the Libyan coasts up to international waters in the Mediterranean. Then there are, if we look at technologies, there are technologies provided to local governments in different countries, which are basically technologies to register people's biometric information at border points, in airports, and in at land borders. And this is really kind of it's not an expensive technology, but it's quite important as well. Even if looking at the money, it's not so big, but it's and this connects with also all sorts of databases, basically, which have been adopted by countries in Africa. For example, voting, the systems which adopts biometric documents and biometric databases, but also criminal databases. And there are all sorts of databases, like as an example, there's a criminal database that involves most West African countries, the West Africa Police Information System, but then which has been a project of the EU and the Interpol and then other actors for the past 10 years or so. And it keeps going, it keeps being refunded, even if most countries are not actually adopting it. They're very slow in adopting it. But the idea is, okay, we just need time, and little by little, this system will be adopted, will be put in place, and we will use other ways to convince local authorities actually to adopt it and to install workstations and all the practical tools to make it work. And then there is like the G5 Sahel, which is this 5-country group organization created in 2014, which whose main activity is to having this military coordination center between 5 countries in the Sahel. It's been heavily funded by the European Union. The EU is the main donor of this program, which is really opaque. And it's basically was supposed to be a coordination program, so the military of Niger can do joint operation with the military of Mali, since most jihadist activities is between the borders of these 2 countries, so they need to coordinate. But then they have a police component as well, and they have all sorts of systems to to record information and share information between themselves, and which also adds up to other databases. So kind of there's a rush to access, record, and store data in a context where most of these countries don't have a proper, privacy, data protection, and law and system, where they have a data protection authority, but which is usually underfunded, not independent, which is not, well, I mean, we can say the same about Italy, but most countries in Europe probably, but I mean, it's clearly kind of has been put in place also to comply with some European requests, but then practically, yeah, they don't have a real oversight, and there's no mechanism of monitoring exactly what is going on, and so yeah, I mean, this happens in a place where clearly for citizens and people and migrants and refugees passing at the land borders, it's the worst, the least of problems to being recorded, even if, I mean, you could be legitimately afraid of what will happen with your data, because everybody knows this is part of a bigger surveillance scheme, and also some refugee on the move, which is not listening to our talks and which is not reading Privacy International website or international media, probably, and I mean, is aware that it's that all these systems are operating against him, basically. Then I would say there's also an issue with the humanitarian operations and how much they rely on biometric information, which is also sold as a tool to to avoid scams, to avoid that people who are not in need can access to humanitarian aid and the likes. But actually, it's also a way to control people, and it's problematic, because sometimes humanitarian agencies are providing local governments, local authoritarian repressive governments, with tools to tools to produce documents for refugees, the biometric documents for refugees, for example, and then where are this information going, and what if the any other actor wants to access this information, like the CIA or the FBI wants to have information on refugees in northern Nigeria, because it's an area where extremist groups are operating, and even if they don't have any suspect that this people is linked, someone that could be linked, but yeah, so it's problematic, because yeah, there could be data breaches quite easily. There could be also data it's really difficult, I would say impossible, for people to know how their personal data are being used with accessing them. Then, yeah, I would say, for example, if you look at technologies, wiretapping interception technologies also have been provided to countries, especially to counter migration, counter trafficking in the Sahel and in sub-Saharan Africa as a whole. Like there's a new anti-smuggling center which has been opened in Khartoum in Sudan, for example, which aims at coordinating on behalf of the African Union different anti-smuggling policies. But even there, it has been funded by the EU and managed by the German Cooperation Agency, and they will have also access to data. They will develop their own, use their own technologies, and so there's also this support to local authorities policing, migration, and policing also the web, for example, and also drones for local police, and for example, especially border police, custom authorities, they've been provided with drones. Then there's a problem in providing lethal equipment to security forces, but still a lot of equipment has been provided. But now with the new African peace facility, this kind of will be bypassed, because the EU will be able also to provide lethal equipment to their partners in Africa. So it's it's a set of basically police and technologies for police and security forces to control borders, to monitor people, to record personal data, which accompanies probably, if you look, I mean, it's there are some projects which are really expensive in terms of spending, is really high. Of course, if you need to buy a vessel for the Navy and to make it work for years, it's hundreds of millions of euros. While if you buy a biometric system with 10 workstations to put at the main border posts, it's not so expensive in the end. But still, it's very important, and that's why European donors are really continuing to fund this type of projects. Then, of course, it's it's grasp, what will happen in the future. It looks like something is preparing. There's a race for personal data, and Europe wants to have their eyes on something. So to have good collaboration with local police authorities, with local military when possible, with so in order that once these tools are set up, once these technologies have actually been adopted and are working, then at one point they will be able to say, okay, why don't we make a system so that we are able to connect the Western Africa information system with the Europol information system, or to make them, to create a possibility to match and to search for information in both databases, and that someone somewhere at least could access to both, or some software can match information in order to see whether a Nigerian was expelled from Sweden before, and then he got back and arrived in France, and then whatever, and then is actually a Nigerian, so we don't need that the Nigerian embassy in France cooperates with us in identifying the person. But well, there's a database, there's fingerprints, there's just let's remove him.
100%. Like a global race for Africans' data, eh? Just funneling more into it. And I mean, it's explicit now in the Balkans, for example, where they're funding the development of the nationwide biometric ID systems in the countries, specifically to become what they call interoperable with EU systems. So basically then they'll be able to exchange the data real easily for things like deportations, or just to find out who's going through border crossings. And then oftentimes, like when we've kind of communicated with the Commission agencies about this, they'll say things like, we've worked to ensure that there's a sufficient legal framework, and also we won't have access to this data. So you're kind of left thinking, oh, that's okay then. But the thing is, the power imbalance is just so great that they've got things like, we could cut off that aid, we could cut off your security aid, and also we could cut off your visa access if you don't give us data on request. And that's like explicit EU policy now, that like they'll use visa access of like the elites within these countries who obviously want to be able to continue traveling to Europe as a means of leverage to make sure that these agencies, once they're equipped with the databases and with biometric tools, will be able to provide that data to the European agencies upon request. So they have all these different sources of leverage, even if they're not directly accessing it, so to say. And as you say, like just the thing that this idea that you know, we've worked to make sure that there's laws in place that will provide sufficient safeguards. As you say, across the EU, the data protection regime just isn't enforced well at all. These European agencies are just not providing sufficient protections to make sure that even the European data protection regulations are well enforced. So what is to stop? So for example, the data that's collected and then used to make sure people are verified during election processes being accessed by the police or by military or internal security forces. So in a context where, as you said, people are being arrested, their online communications are being spied on, the risk is just incredible. And it just seems like a very fucking irresponsible thing to be financing towards. So just kind of taking a step back from that, you obviously work as a freelance journalist. You do these like absolutely in-depth investigations and so on. How do you publicize them in an age where there's so much competition for attention? You have the attention economy, you have people on social media. There's so many things to really, I think, be concerned about. How do you publicize your work?
Well, yeah, that's an issue. I mean, of course, on one side, social media can be a platform for visibility, but it's also, I mean, additional, you know, part of the work, which I don't think necessarily freelance journalists are supposed to do and are able to do also, actually, and. So basically, yeah, I've been using social media for, you know, promoting my job, but I felt somehow this is something that needs to be tackled, and I feel quite bad when I hear or read like journalist association, journalist trade unions in Italy, for example, that are promoting training courses to help you manage your social media, because it's really kind of fragmenting. We're already working in a market which is completely trying to isolate us. So this is for the, okay, you need to be, you are, you know, an individual businessman, you need to take care of your activity, social media are important. I mean, it has worked for many people, but I think as a model for me, and I see this for lots of colleagues, it's problematic because it takes away lots of your time if you want to do it properly. And then it's also, I mean, someone might just be willing to focus on what we are working on, which is already kind of really absorbing. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a solution, but I think that's this can feed this idea of competition for limited resources in the media market. And I feel like as freelance journalists, we are producing the bulk of investigative journalism today in the world. If we take away a few big media outlets who have their own investigative unit, but most of the time, even in those cases, it's freelance journalists providing contact to big media, and that's because it's impossible to reach out and to follow for like 6 months, 1 year, a story for maybe one single publication for someone who's working inside a newspaper, or to really dig in one area, to travel a lot, for example, when needed. So I think there's a crucial role of freelance journalists in the media today all over the world, and it's important to for me to take a step back from this overexposition and on social media, which is also seen as a competition from some visibility space, and try to create connections between us, to create, to make for some sort of cooperation rather than competition, and also because it makes a lot of sense in terms of what we can access, of how we can work, and it's a way also for me to tackle exploitative forms of work which are happening. Probably I'm not sure about what is happening in the UK, for example, but for sure in Southern Mediterranean, in Southern Europe, it's the way like freelance journalists are surviving. It's bringing together lots of things, lots of jobs, and trying to survive out of this. So and being underpaid all the time. So it's really vital to create some ways to also to avoid competition, and also to I would say go out of this social media trap, which social media can be useful, but find also different ways to access the public. I mean, I don't know, with some colleagues in Italy, we created a collective of freelance journalists, and one of the ideas was to also showcase our work without having to have our own personal page, just saying, okay, I'm Giacomo, I published this beautiful investigation, you have to read it, please share a lot, because at least because the editor just forgot completely about me, and I'm badly paid, but at least I have 200 likes on Facebook. So
it just seems so like, I can imagine just absolutely hating the world if I've gone through this effort, done long form investigative journalism, loads of travel, spoken to people, to then try and package that up into a tweet to make sure people click on it so that they engage, so they create more data for billionaires, essentially. I would just feel like, oh my God, so disheartened, man. And then I guess there must be a pressure for freelance journalists nowadays to build a following, because I guess from an editor's point of view, the more you have, then the more marketable you are, the more clicks you're going to get, right?
Yeah, definitely. And well, then I think it's for someone can work, then but I don't think we need to see this as a model, because there are very good individual players that can use the freelancing opportunity to expose their great work. But at the same time, I think we need to put much more value on collaboration as a way to achieve more, to expose more, bad things happening, and also good things, hopefully sometimes. And I think this is, it's really important to do. And I've been experimenting this, and I know really talented journalists who are basically not active on social media, but are producing some of the best reporting around. but yeah, then I see, of course, my friends who are not journalists but just want to get informed and use Instagram or whatever. I mean, sometimes I criticize them. I say, okay, look, this guy is really, he understood how the system is working. He has lots of followers, but then, you know, well, I mean, I'm a bit critical towards native social media journalism when it's leading to, you know, kind of increasing this mechanism. But I also understand that, you know, everybody.
It's where people are. Unfortunately, it's where people like me, we have to. It's unbelievable that so many people understand the harms, yet we still have to kind of, we're trapped by it almost, because it's where you get so much information, so much news. It's unbelievable we've not found a viable alternative, even though they do exist. Like technically, there are like alternatives out there. It's just the more people they've got on it, the more we're trapped by it. It's bad.
Yeah. Well, overall, if we want to, I don't know if this has any sense, but what I've been trying to do recently is, if we want to, as journalists, to tackle also surveillance and misuse of our personal data and data in general, well, it's really important to, you know, to have this connections between different platforms, actors, between journalists and activists and advocacy groups and you know, and trying to to also to reflect on how we work in as kind of white privileged guys traveling the world, on how we work when we have a privilege to go to countries in Africa, for example, and how we also collaborate with local colleagues. So I think these issues are really important for journalism in the upcoming years, but also we need to, you know, to not be necessarily in a rush to get to the, you know, to the revelation and to and, you know, and to have the best out of our investigation, which is important, but also to create good methodologies on how to reach there, because I think this would last for a longer period. And if we have relations, if we have connections in different places, if we can work, and we can also try from to, you know, to tackle a bit these inequalities. And for example, I would love to see my colleagues from West Africa report on migration in Europe. And this is impossible. I mean, having, I don't know, a Guinean or a Ivorian journalist going to report on the condition of migrants who are exploited as a cheap labor force in southern Italy in agriculture. That would be really important for me. And while on my side, basically, I can go to the Ivory Coast with spending money, and no, it's not so easy necessarily, but I can access to some grant opportunities, to some funding. I can, which are not there basically for colleagues in most of the world. So that's a lucky part of also of being a European citizen. It's.
Is it so? Like, are journalism grants available to people outside of Europe generally, like in less developed countries, or is that the majority of the granting towards well-developed countries?
Yeah, there are, but I would say compared to like European journalism grants, it's like small things, like grant to, and well, as a European journalist, when we try accessing a grant, apply for a grant. We can also include colleagues in countries in Africa and do a collaboration. And I think that's also important when possible. I mean, and also now that there's an opportunity for the pandemic, which is also restricting our movement still now, to kind of give more value to local journalists in different areas. I mean, if it has become quite expensive and tiring, and I need to test multiple times if I want to go to whatever country in Africa, then why can't I work with a local reporter who knows the country, the language, everything much better than I do? And
it's not just journalism, it's obviously it's advocacy as well. I mean, we're an NGO based in London. We don't know like what's going on in Niger. Like it should be those agencies, those civil society agencies who are working on these issues, who are granted towards it, who have the expertise and the skills to be able to do it. So it's very important that essentially, I mean, my sector is as colonized, I think, it comes from that tradition probably as much as journalism does. So certainly that's guilty of it as well.